The rare power broken empaths unlock after surviving darkness. Vertical bar, Carl Jung. Have you ever wondered why the most broken souls often carry the deepest wisdom? Carl Jung believed that only by walking through the darkest shadows can a rare power awaken within us. Today we will uncover the extraordinary transformation of the empath who survives the darkness and emerges with a strength the world rarely understands. Part 1. The journey of the broken empath entering the darkness. An empath's life is not simply about being sensitive or kind-hearted. It is a psychological structure deeply tied to what Carl Jung would call the unconscious. An empath absorbs emotions, atmospheres, and archetypal energies as if they were their own. For some, this appears as a gift of compassion, but for the broken empath, it often begins as a curse. Their story is defined by collapse, fragmentation, and the heavy toll of absorbing too much darkness from the world around them. The empath becomes broken because they cannot filter out what belongs to them and what belongs to others. This blurred boundary exposes them to the unconscious forces Jung described as shadow projections. A friend's anger, a partner's betrayal, or a family's dysfunction does not remain external. It enters the empath's psyche as if it were their own wound. Over time, this unending process of absorption overwhelms their nervous system and cracks their sense of self. The absorption of collective pain. Jung emphasized the reality of the collective unconscious, a shared reservoir of humanity's instincts, images, and emotions. Empaths, more than most, are porous to this collective field. When society is anxious, they feel it like a storm inside their chest. When a loved one is repressed or dishonest, they intuitively sense the dissonance. They are tuned to archetypal frequencies, but without awareness, this tuning becomes a constant bombardment. The broken empath is not destroyed by one single trauma. Rather, it is the accumulation of repeated psychic invasions. Imagine carrying the anger of a father, the sadness of a mother, the jealousy of a sibling, and the hidden resentments of a partner, all layered into the empath's nervous system. Slowly, their psyche cannot differentiate what is theirs and what is foreign. Jung would call this a loss of ego boundaries. The conscious self is flooded by the unconscious, and the person feels they are drowning in emotions with no clear center. The collapse of identity. Jung's psychology insists on the importance of the ego, the conscious point of reference through which we relate to life. Without a strong ego, a person cannot withstand the currents of the unconscious. For the empath who has lived in constant openness, the ego eventually fragments. They begin to ask, who am I? Am I these emotions? Am I this suffering? The collapse of identity follows, and this collapse is what we call being broken. But Jung would not see this collapse as an end. Rather, it is the dismantling of a false structure. The empath's previous sense of self was too fragile, too dependent on harmony, and too naive about the destructive forces within and around them. Being broken is the destruction of this false stability, making way for something stronger, deeper, and more authentic to emerge. The dark night of the soul. Mystics throughout history have spoken of the dark night of the soul, a stage of emptiness, despair, and isolation that precedes transformation. Jung understood this in psychological terms. He observed that when individuals are forced to confront their shadow, the repressed, denied, and unconscious parts of themselves, they enter a period of darkness. For the empath, this dark night is intensified. They are not only facing their own repressed wounds, but also the emotional weight of others that they have carried. Depression, anxiety, and a sense of inner chaos become overwhelming. Life may appear meaningless. Trust in relationships may disintegrate because betrayal and disappointment often accompany their experiences. It is in this crucible of pain that the empath begins to awaken to a new dimension of selfhood. To survive, they must ask questions they once avoided. Why do I allow others to drain me? Why do I confuse compassion with self-sacrifice? Why do I feel responsible for everyone's healing but neglect my own? These questions force the empath to recognize patterns that were previously unconscious. The encounter with the shadow. Jung's concept of the shadow is central here. The shadow is not only the personal repressed material, anger, selfishness, jealousy, but also the aspects of collective humanity we deny. For empaths, the shadow often manifests in paradoxical ways. Outwardly, they appear selfless and giving. Inwardly, they may harbor unacknowledged rage at constantly being taken advantage of. Outwardly, they project harmony. Inwardly, they may secretly envy those who set boundaries with ease. The breaking point forces the empath to encounter these shadows. When they collapse, they cannot maintain the mask of eternal goodness anymore. Rage bursts out, grief overwhelms them, bitterness shakes them. These are not failures, they are revelations. The empath realizes they too have darkness. In Jung's language, they are integrating the shadow, recognizing that wholeness requires owning the parts of the self that were long denied. Why empaths are destined to break? It might seem cruel that empaths, with all their sensitivity, are destined to experience this breaking. But Jung would argue that individuation, the process of becoming whole, demands confrontation with the unconscious. The empath's gift of sensitivity ensures they cannot avoid this confrontation. Unlike others who can numb themselves with distractions, the empath is too porous. They feel too deeply to ignore the truth. Their breaking is inevitable because their soul demands transformation. From a Jungian lens, this breaking is the psyche's way of initiating growth. Just as the caterpillar must dissolve into mush before becoming a butterfly, the empath must dissolve their old self before discovering the rare power hidden within their brokenness. Fragmentation as preparation. The empath's brokenness can be seen as a preparatory stage. When everything collapses, when relationships fail, when their sense of worth shatters, the empath is forced to look inward. Jung said, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate." For the empath, breaking is the moment when unconscious patterns, martyrdom, overgiving, self-abandonment, are exposed as unsustainable. It is a harsh preparation. Yet paradoxically, it is also a gift. The empath is invited into an initiation process that few people ever face. They are initiated into the raw truth of human existence, that suffering, darkness, and shadow are not to be avoided, but integrated. This initiation lays the foundation for the rare power they will later awaken: loneliness and the abyss. One of the most defining features of the broken empath's journey is loneliness. Having given endlessly, they often find themselves abandoned when they need support most. Friends who once relied on their compassion disappear. Partners who exploited their empathy leave. Family may dismiss their struggles, labeling them as too sensitive. This loneliness is brutal, but Jung saw solitude as necessary for individuation. Only in solitude can one hear the voice of the inner self. The empath, stripped of external roles and validation, begins to hear something deeper stirring. At first it is just pain, but slowly, if they can endure the abyss, a new center begins to form. The threshold of transformation. Being broken is not the final destination, it is a threshold. The empath has entered the darkness, confronted the shadow, endured the collapse of identity, and tasted the abyss of loneliness. They are at the border of something extraordinary. The threshold is terrifying because nothing of the old life feels secure anymore. But it is precisely this instability that allows for rebirth. The empath has survived the impossible, the crushing weight of absorbing collective darkness, and in surviving they are prepared to awaken a power that is rare, profound, and deeply transformative. Part 2. Facing the darkness. The turning point of transformation. When an empath reaches the stage of brokenness, survival demands that they confront what they once avoided. They can no longer sustain the illusion that kindness alone is enough to protect them. The collapse that shatters their old identity forces them into direct confrontation with the unconscious forces Jung called the shadow. This confrontation is not comfortable, nor is it short-lived. It is the slow, grinding process of looking into the darkest corners of the psyche and discovering what has been hidden there for years. The shadow as an unavoidable reality. Carl Jung believed that every human being has a shadow, the rejected, unacknowledged aspects of the self. For most people, the shadow remains unconscious, projected onto others. But for the empath, projection is not enough. They absorb not only their own hidden darkness, but also the unowned shadows of others. When life breaks them, they are no longer able to maintain the denial. The shadow is no longer external, it demands entry into awareness. An empath might feel sudden waves of anger they never allowed themselves to feel. They might uncover jealousy, resentment, or desires they once believed were unacceptable. This revelation is destabilizing because it challenges their self-image as purely compassionate and selfless. Jung argued that individuation requires embracing the shadow because only by acknowledging what we deny can we become whole. The broken empath in this sense is forced into individuation. Their suffering is the entry ticket to deeper self-knowledge. The pain of self-confrontation. Facing the shadow is not simply an intellectual realization, it is visceral. The empath may wake up trembling with rage, feeling betrayed by those they loved most. They may experience grief so deep that it feels endless, or bitterness that scares them. They may even feel hatred toward those who used their kindness. For an empath who built their identity around being good, these emotions feel like poison. But Jung emphasized that the shadow is not evil in itself. It is merely the part of the self that has been repressed. Hatred can be transformed into discernment. Rage can be transformed into boundary setting. Bitterness can become clarity. The task is not to deny these emotions, but to integrate them, to understand their message. This is why the empath's turning point begins, not when they reject the darkness, but when they allow themselves to feel it fully without fear. Breaking the illusion of the eternal caretaker. A central archetypal illusion for many empaths is the eternal caretaker. They are conditioned often since childhood to believe their worth lies in self-sacrifice. They carry family burdens, smooth over conflicts, and absorb tension to keep the peace. Over time, this archetype becomes a prison. When brokenness arrives, the illusion collapses. The empath realizes that caretaking has cost them their own life. They see how they enabled toxic dynamics by refusing to set boundaries. They see how love was often manipulation disguised as need. Jung wrote that archetypes are powerful but dangerous when unconscious. The eternal caretaker archetype, once exposed, reveals its shadow, martyrdom, resentment, and dependency. At this stage, the empath begins to reclaim their right to exist outside of service to others. This shift is revolutionary. It marks the birth of autonomy, the alchemy of suffering. Jung often compared psychological growth to alchemy. In alchemy, base metals are transformed into gold through a process of fire dissolution and recombination. For the empath, suffering acts as the fire. Brokenness dissolves their old identity. Facing the shadow is the alchemical stage of nigredo, the blackening where everything known disintegrates. In this darkened state, nothing feels certain. Yet Jung insisted that it is precisely in the nigredo that transformation becomes possible. The empath's pain begins to rearrange itself. Each wave of grief or rage becomes material for psychological growth. They learn that emotions are not enemies, but raw energies waiting for integration. This alchemy is slow. The empath does not wake up one morning healed. They pass through cycles of despair, confrontation, and insight. But slowly a new psychic structure is forming, one that no longer collapses under the weight of others' emotions. The gift of discernment. One of the first powers to emerge in this process is discernment. A broken empath who has faced their darkness begins to sense the difference between compassion and self-betrayal. They can recognize manipulation in a tone of voice, dishonesty in a smile, or hidden motives in words that once charmed them. This is not paranoia. It is the sharpening of perception that comes from integrating the shadow. Jung taught that until we know our own darkness, we cannot recognize it in others. Once the empath acknowledges their capacity for anger, they can spot anger disguised as kindness. Once they admit their vulnerability to manipulation, they can see manipulation for what it is. Discernment is the empath's first weapon after brokenness. It is not loud or aggressive, it is silent, steady clarity. The transformation of boundaries. For most of their lives, empaths lacked boundaries. They confused openness with love, believing that to protect themselves was to abandon others. Facing the darkness changes this. The broken empath begins to see that without boundaries they are not offering love, but enabling harm. Jung emphasized that individuation requires differentiation, the capacity to stand apart from the collective and claim one's own psychic space. Boundaries are the practical expression of individuation. The empath learns to say no without guilt, to step away without apology, to protect their energy as fiercely as they once gave it away. These boundaries are not walls of bitterness, but expressions of self-respect. They are the outer reflection of an inner realization. The empath's life is their own, not a canvas for others to paint their wounds upon. The reversal of roles. One of the most striking changes in this stage is the reversal of roles. Before, the empath was always the caretaker, the listener, the emotional sponge. After facing the darkness, they begin to invert the dynamic. They no longer chase those who drain them. Instead, people begin to chase them. This reversal is archetypal. In myth, the wounded hero descends into the underworld, confronts death, and returns with treasures that others need. The broken empath, having survived the psychological underworld, now carries wisdom and strength that others unconsciously seek. This marks the beginning of their rare power. They no longer serve from weakness, but radiate from resilience. The turning point defined. The empath's turning point is not marked by external validation. It is an inner shift, almost imperceptible at first. They stop apologizing for existing. They stop sacrificing themselves in the name of harmony. They stop mistaking love for servitude. Instead, they begin to embody a new presence. Their silence becomes powerful. Their refusal to engage with toxic patterns becomes a statement. Their willingness to sit with their own shadow gives them a depth that others cannot ignore. This turning point in Jungian terms is the beginning of individuation in earnest. The empath is no longer just reacting to life, they are shaping it from within. The emergence of a new center. Jung described the self as the totality of the psyche, the organizing principle beyond the ego. For the empath, the journey into darkness cracks open the possibility of aligning with the self. They no longer identify solely with being good or selfless. They begin to recognize a deeper center that includes both light and dark, both compassion and strength. This new center is resilient. It does not collapse under projection. It does not depend on external approval. It carries the memory of brokenness but is no longer defined by it. The empath who has reached this stage is no longer broken. They are being rebuilt on a foundation that cannot be easily shaken. The silent power of survival. Survival itself becomes a form of power. Many who face such darkness do not endure it. But the empath, though fragile on the surface, possesses a hidden strength. Their sensitivity, once a curse, becomes the very reason they adapt. Because they feel so much, they also learn so much. Every wound becomes information. Every collapse becomes material for growth. This silent power is not boastful. It is not aggressive. It is simply the quiet strength of someone who has lived through hell and returned. This survival marks the true turning point, because once an empath has survived their own darkness, they are no longer afraid of the darkness of others. Part 3. The rare power after surviving. The deep emotional wisdom. Survival changes an empath in ways that no surface-level self-help advice could ever accomplish. To be broken and then survive is not merely to return to normal life. It is to awaken a dimension of emotional wisdom that is rare, almost otherworldly. The empath who has walked through the darkness emerges with a sharpened ability to see, feel, and interpret reality. Jung would argue that this transformation signals the movement from unconscious victimhood toward conscious individuation, from sensitivity to discernment. Before their collapse, the empath's sensitivity was diffuse. They absorbed everything: joy, sorrow, tension, without discrimination. After surviving darkness, sensitivity becomes focused. What was once overwhelming now sharpens into discernment. They are no longer drowned by every emotion around them. Instead, they can track patterns, distinguish authenticity from deception, and recognize truth beneath the masks people wear. Jung believed that awareness of the unconscious produces wisdom. The empath, having been broken now, sees clearly the difference between love and manipulation, between empathy and exploitation. This discernment is not cynical, it is born of pain. They no longer mistake intensity for intimacy, nor chaos for passion. They know the cost of illusions, and their wisdom reflects it. Emotional X-ray vision. One of the rare powers awakened is a form of emotional X-ray vision. The empath can perceive hidden motives behind polished words, feel the dissonance in someone's tone, and intuit what is not being said. This is not mystical in a supernatural sense. It is the product of having been immersed in unconscious darkness. Jung wrote that the psyche has its own logic, and it is not always the logic of reason. The empath who survived darkness understands this instinctively. They can sense contradictions in others, because they have wrestled with contradictions in themselves. They no longer require proof to feel when something is wrong. This inner compass makes them resistant to the lies that once trapped them. The end of naive compassion. Compassion for the broken empath no longer means unlimited giving. Before they poured themselves into others, endlessly confusing compassion with martyrdom. After surviving darkness, compassion becomes mature. They see that true empathy respects both self and other. To enable dysfunction is not compassion, it is collusion with harm. Jung insisted that integration means balancing opposites. For the empath, this means balancing compassion with boundaries, generosity with self-respect. They can still love deeply, but they no longer allow love to be weaponized against them. This maturity makes their compassion more powerful because it comes from choice, not compulsion. The emergence of psychic immunity. Having endured so much psychic invasion, the empath develops what can be called psychic immunity. Manipulation that once drained them now loses its power. They can detect narcissistic tactics before they take root. They can withdraw their energy before being consumed. This immunity is not indifference, it is strength. Jung's work emphasized the danger of identification with archetypes. The empath once identified with the archetype of the martyr, making them vulnerable. After integration, they step into the archetype of the healer, not because they rescue others, but because their presence itself carries resilience. Their immunity radiates as a stabilizing force. Wisdom in silence. Surviving darkness teaches the empath that words are not always necessary. Silence becomes their ally. They learn that silence can reveal more than speech, and restraint can be more powerful than confrontation. In silence, they can observe without being entangled, hold their ground without aggression, and allow others to reveal their truth. Jung suggested that the self communicates in symbols, images, and silence rather than constant verbal noise. The broken empath aligns with this principle. Their wisdom speaks in subtle ways through a calm gaze, a quiet refusal, or a steady presence. Recognition of archetypal patterns. One of the most profound changes is the empath's capacity to recognize archetypal dynamics. They no longer see relationships merely as personal dramas. They see the archetypes at play: the victim, the persecutor, the rescuer, the trickster, the shadow mother, the wounded father. They can identify these patterns in conversations, in conflicts, and even in their own behaviors. This recognition is transformative. It frees them from repeating cycles. When they see someone attempting to pull them into a victim-persecutor loop, they can step aside. When they sense the archetype of the manipulative seducer, they can disengage before harm occurs. Jung believed that archetypes govern much of human behavior unconsciously. The empath who survived learns to read these archetypes consciously, giving them a rare advantage. The power of emotional transmutation. Another rare gift that emerges is the ability to transmute emotions. Where once anger consumed them, now it becomes fuel for action. Where grief paralyzed them, now it becomes empathy for others. Where fear crippled them, now it becomes intuition. This process mirrors Jung's view of alchemy. Painful emotions are not destroyed but transformed. The broken empath becomes an alchemist of the psyche, turning base, suffering into wisdom, despair into compassion, and weakness into strength. This transmutation is not theoretical, it is lived every day in how they respond to challenges. The birth of authentic authority. The empath who survived no longer seeks authority outside themselves. They no longer look for validation through pleasing others. Instead, they develop an inner authority rooted in experience. Their words carry weight because they come from lived truth, not abstract ideas. Jung observed that individuation produces a sense of alignment with the self, which manifests as authenticity. The empath, once broken, now speaks and acts with authenticity. People feel it, trust it, and are drawn to it. Their authority is not imposed but recognized. An aura of resilience. Perhaps the most visible sign of their rare power is their aura of resilience. Others sense it before the empath says a word. It is the quiet confidence of someone who has already faced their worst fears and survived. They no longer flinch at conflict nor collapse under criticism. They carry themselves with a calm strength that cannot be faked. This aura is magnetic. People gravitate toward it, sensing safety and wisdom. Yet the empath no longer allows themselves to be drained by everyone who approaches. They choose carefully where to invest their energy, guided by discernment and self-respect. Becoming a wounded healer, Jung spoke of the archetype of the wounded healer, those who, by healing their own wounds, become capable of guiding others. The broken empath embodies this archetype. Their wounds are not erased, but transformed into sources of wisdom. They can sit with the pain of others without being overwhelmed because they have sat with their own. This does not mean they take on the role of savior again. Instead, they offer presence, understanding, and guidance without losing themselves. They are healers not because they fix others, but because their existence testifies that healing is possible. The hidden strength of vulnerability. Perhaps the rarest power is the integration of vulnerability with strength. Most people see vulnerability as weakness, but the empath who survived darkness knows it is the opposite. To be vulnerable is to be real, to allow authenticity even when it is risky. Their vulnerability is now conscious. They can admit pain without collapsing. They can express needs without shame. They can allow intimacy without fear of being consumed. This balance of openness and strength makes their relationships deeper and healthier than before. A new relationship with the collective unconscious. Finally, surviving darkness changes how the empath relates to the collective unconscious itself. They are no longer helpless receivers of collective energies. Instead, they become interpreters. They can channel collective emotions into art, writing, leadership, or guidance. Their sensitivity becomes a gift to the community rather than a burden. Jung believed that individuals who integrate their unconscious contribute to the healing of the collective. The broken empath, through their survival, does exactly that. Their personal transformation ripples outward, helping others confront their own shadows. Part 4. The rebirth of the empath, from victim to creator. The empath's survival of darkness is not the end of the story. It is the threshold of rebirth. Where they were once passive recipients of others' emotions, they now become active creators of their own lives. Jung would describe this as the movement from being unconsciously shaped by archetypal forces to consciously cooperating with them. The empath, having integrated shadow and awakened discernment, now steps into a role of empowerment. This is the stage where the victim archetype dissolves and a new creator archetype emerges. The death of the old self. Rebirth begins with death. The empath's old self, the fragile identity built on pleasing others, sacrificing without limit, and denying their own needs, must die. This death is not physical but psychological. It is the end of living as a mirror for everyone else's wounds. Jung explained that individuation often requires the dissolution of outdated psychic structures. For the empath, this dissolution feels like loss. Friendships fade, relationships collapse, family roles no longer fit. What dies is the false self that was built on adaptation and fear. In its place, a more authentic self begins to rise. The creator archetype emerges. As the empath lets go of their victimhood, a new archetype surfaces: the creator. No longer defined by what others impose, they begin to consciously shape their own reality. They make choices not from obligation but from intention. Their energy shifts from survival to creation. Jung suggested that archetypes evolve as we integrate them. The empath, who once embodied the archetype of the martyr, now evolves into the archetype of the healer-creator. They do not wait for life to define them. They define life through their decisions, their art, their relationships, and their boundaries. Boundaries as creative power boundaries, once a struggle, now become tools of creation. By saying no, the empath creates space for authentic yes. By withdrawing from toxic dynamics, they create the conditions for healthy connections. Every boundary becomes a brushstroke in the painting of their life. Jung taught that individuation requires differentiation, the ability to stand apart from the collective. For the reborn empath, boundaries are the external evidence of differentiation. They prove that the empath has moved from fusion with others to alignment with their own center. Boundaries are no longer about defense alone. They are about shaping the environment where the empath's true self can flourish, turning pain into purpose. The rebirth stage is marked by the alchemy of turning pain into purpose. What once felt meaningless now becomes the source of meaning. The empath begins to use their suffering as raw material for growth, creativity, and contribution. They may channel their experiences into art, writing, teaching, or healing professions. They may become advocates for those still trapped in toxic systems. They may simply live as examples of resilience. Whatever form it takes, their pain is no longer wasted. It becomes a catalyst for purpose. Jung observed that the psyche strives for wholeness. For the empath, wholeness includes the transformation of trauma into wisdom. The wounds remain, but they are no longer open. They become scars that tell a story of survival and meaning. Authentic relationships rebirth also transforms how the empath relates to others. No longer desperate for approval, they approach relationships from authenticity. They do not fear solitude, so they do not cling to toxic bonds. They value reciprocity, depth, and honesty. In Jungian terms, they are no longer projecting their anima or animus unconsciously onto others. They have integrated these inner figures, which allows them to see partners, friends, and family more clearly. Instead of seeking someone to complete them, they seek companions to walk beside them. This authenticity creates relationships that are healthier, deeper, and more resilient. The empath no longer plays roles, they simply are. Creativity as a life force. One of the most profound aspects of rebirth is the awakening of creativity. Having survived the void, the empath discovers that life itself is creative. They may feel drawn to express themselves in new ways: art, music, writing, entrepreneurship, spiritual practices. This creativity is not just about producing things, it is about living creatively, making choices that reflect their inner truth rather than external pressure. Jung argued that the self, the central archetype of wholeness, expresses itself through symbols and creative acts. The reborn empath, aligned with the self, naturally becomes a vessel for creativity. The freedom of self-ownership. The empath's rebirth is also the discovery of freedom. They realize that their life belongs to them. Their emotions, their energy, their choices, these are theirs to own. This realization is liberating after years of living as if they existed only for others. Freedom does not mean selfishness. It means sovereignty. The empath can give, but they no longer give from compulsion. They can love, but they no longer confuse love with slavery. They can serve, but they do so by choice, not by guilt. Jung wrote that individuation leads to a sense of inner authority. The reborn empath embodies this authority. They own themselves fully, and in doing so they inspire others to do the same. Integration of light and dark. Perhaps the most essential feature of rebirth is the integration of opposites. The empath no longer sees themselves as purely light, nor do they fear their darkness. They recognize that both are part of wholeness. This integration manifests in balance. They can be compassionate, but firm, gentle, but strong, open, but discerning. They are no longer one-dimensional. Their personality carries depth and complexity, reflecting Jung's belief that individuation unites conscious and unconscious elements into harmony. The empath becomes paradoxical in the best way, soft and strong, vulnerable and powerful, broken yet whole. This paradox is the essence of their rare power. The end of victimhood. Victimhood is not just a circumstance, it is an identity. Before rebirth, the empath unconsciously lived as a victim of manipulation, of projection, of betrayal. After rebirth, they shed this identity. They recognize that while they cannot control what happens to them, they can control their response. This shift is monumental. Jung taught that taking responsibility for one's inner world is the path to individuation. The empath's rebirth is marked by this responsibility. They stop waiting for others to change. They stop expecting rescue. They realize they are their own rescuer. In this sense, rebirth is empowerment. The empath is no longer defined by wounds, but by the wisdom that comes from healing them. Living as a creator. The ultimate expression of rebirth is living as a creator. Every choice becomes a creation. Every relationship becomes an artwork. Every boundary becomes architecture. The empath no longer drifts through life reacting to others. They build their own path guided by their inner self. Jung would say they are now cooperating with the process of individuation. They are not fighting the unconscious, but working with it, listening to its symbols, following its guidance. Life becomes less about survival and more about creation. This creative stance is rare because it requires having faced the darkness fully. Only by dying to their old self could the empath awaken to this new life. Part 5. The spiritual and psychological meaning, the empath as a guide through darkness. The empath, who has walked through the night of brokenness, faced the shadow, and embraced rebirth, now carries a significance that extends beyond personal healing. Their journey reflects both psychological depth and spiritual purpose. Jung argued that individuation not only transforms the individual but also contributes to the collective unconscious. In this final stage, the empath becomes more than a survivor. They become a guide, a carrier of light, into the very places where others still stumble in darkness. The archetype of the wounded healer, Jung, and later thinkers identified the archetype of the wounded healer as central to transformation. The empath embodies this archetype in a unique way. Their wounds were not superficial, they were broken by absorbing the pain of others. Yet through healing, those wounds have become a source of wisdom. The wounded healer is not someone without scars. On the contrary, the scars themselves are the credentials. The empath who has survived can sit with someone else's suffering without collapsing because they have sat with their own. They can listen without judgment because they know judgment only deepens wounds. They can offer guidance without arrogance because they know healing is never a straight line. The empath as a mirror of the collective. Jung's concept of the collective unconscious means that each individual reflects patterns larger than themselves. The empath, because of their heightened sensitivity, often becomes a mirror of the collective. Their personal darkness was not only theirs, it contained echoes of humanity's pain. When they integrate it, they are not just healing themselves, they are also redeeming fragments of the collective unconscious. This role as mirror makes the reborn empath a guide for society. They can sense where collective energies are blocked, where systems perpetuate harm, where relationships replicate archetypal dysfunctions. Their presence reveals truths others prefer to avoid. The emergence of spiritual authority surviving darkness confers not only psychological wisdom, but spiritual authority. This authority is not based on titles, institutions, or charisma. It is based on authenticity. People sense when someone has truly suffered and emerged whole. They trust those who carry the weight of lived truth. The empath's authority is quiet yet undeniable. It manifests in the way they carry themselves, in the calm of their presence, in the clarity of their discernment. Jung described the self as the organizing principle of the psyche, and alignment with the self radiates outward. The empath, aligned with the self, becomes a beacon not because they intend to lead, but because others instinctively look to them, guiding others through shadow. Perhaps the greatest gift of the broken empath is their ability to guide others through shadow. Most people resist their own darkness. They repress, deny, or project it onto others. But the empath who has faced their shadow can walk beside others without fear. They know the terrain of grief, rage, despair, and hopelessness. They know that these states are not the end, but thresholds. In this role, the empath does not rescue. They do not repeat the old pattern of martyrdom. Instead, they accompany. They remind others that the shadow is survivable, that darkness can be faced without annihilation. They embody Jung's insight that integration, not denial, leads to wholeness, balancing, compassion, and detachment. One of the most profound lessons in this stage is the balance between compassion and detachment. The empath still feels deeply, but they no longer drown. They still care profoundly, but they do not confuse care with entanglement. This balance allows them to remain present without being consumed. Jung emphasized the need for holding opposites, the tension between light and dark self and other compassion and autonomy. The empath's rare power is their ability to embody this balance. Their compassion is authentic, but their detachment protects their integrity. This balance makes them sustainable as guides rather than sacrificial victims. Symbols and synchronicities. As the empath aligns with the self, their life begins to resonate with symbols and synchronicities. Jung believed that synchronicities are meaningful coincidences that reveal the alignment between inner and outer worlds. The empath, through their journey, becomes more attuned to these patterns. They may notice dreams offering guidance, repeated symbols appearing in daily life, or moments of uncanny timing that confirm their path. These synchronicities are not mere chance, they reflect the integration of unconscious and conscious, personal and collective. The empath interprets them not as superstition, but as dialogue with the deeper psyche. Living as a carrier of light. The reborn empath is not defined by perpetual struggle, but by their ability to carry light into dark spaces. This does not mean they deny darkness. On the contrary, their power comes from having faced it. They know light without shadow is illusion. They embody a wholeness that embraces both. In practical terms, they may become mentors, healers, creators, or simply friends who radiate resilience. Their lives testify that brokenness is not the end, but a beginning. Jung would say they live as individuated beings contributing to the healing of the collective. The empath as a symbol of transformation. On the deepest level, the broken empath becomes a living symbol. They represent the possibility of transformation. How sensitivity, once a burden, becomes strength. How brokenness, once despair, becomes rebirth. How darkness, once terrifying, becomes a gateway to light. Symbols, Jung insisted, are the language of the unconscious. The empath's very existence becomes symbolic for others, awakening hope and courage in those still trapped in their own shadows. Without preaching, without persuasion, they embody what Jung called the process of individuation, a human being becoming whole. The rare power defined. The rare power of the broken empath is not superhuman ability, not psychic tricks, not supernatural authority. It is the profoundly human capacity to transform suffering into wisdom, vulnerability, into strength, compassion, into discernment, and brokenness into wholeness. This power cannot be faked because it comes only through lived experience. It is rare because few survive the depth of darkness required to awaken it. It is precious because it serves not only the empath, but everyone they encounter. In Jungian terms, the broken empath becomes a conscious participant in the dance between light and shadow, self and collective suffering and healing. Their rare power is to walk this dance with grace, guiding others not by saving them, but by showing through their life that transformation is possible. You are not broken beyond repair. You are being reshaped into something greater. Jung showed us that facing the shadow is not the end but the beginning of true power. If you have survived the darkness, your story is not one of weakness but of rare strength. And perhaps your journey is the very light someone else is waiting for. Don't forget to like, comment, and share your own experience, because your survival might be the message someone desperately needs.